Just to say that word out there would be something that previous popes had not talked about.
And you got that when you were near him.
What's next?
Good luck trying to bet on this.
How do you think the church will go forward?
Those who know aren't talking, and those who are talking don't know.
Welcome to The Takeaway. I'm Alex Maragos. Today, we're diving deep on the biggest story in the world right now, the death of Pope Francis. And with me today, I have two people who are going to help us understand the Pope, the Church, and both relationship here to Chicago. I have Father Patrick McGrath at Old St. Patrick's Cathedral. Welcome. Nice to have you here. And Marianne Ahern, our political reporter, and also our Catholic Church reporter, who has covered the church for decades. What a big day. Thank you for spending some time with us on this very big day in the church. Marianne, I'm going to start with you. What do we know so far just about the Pope's death, how we found out about it, and all the reaction coming in so far?
The Pope was out yesterday on Easter Sunday. And so now he looked rather frail. But to hear this morning, whoa, everyone kind of said, oh my goodness, we just saw him. It was announced 7:35 Rome time, so that was midnight here. And since then, there's been this whole, what's happened. Just within the last half hour, we have learned the official cause of death. Cerebral stroke that led to a coma and irreversible heart failure. In February, late February, he had double pneumonia. And later, we were told, faced 2 near-death experiences. So he's been quite frail.
Mm-hmm. And Father, we've had, as Marianne mentioned, a couple of close calls with the Pope's health lately. How did you take the news of his passing? Something of a surprise, considering he was just out and about yesterday. He didn't preside over Mass, but was with the people in the Pope Mobile. How did you take the news early this morning?
Oh, you take the news with a great deal of sadness, but a lot of joy for him. You know, I trust that he's home with God now. But as Marianne said, the whole world saw him yesterday, in St. Peter's Square. He did a final lap with the Pope Mobile. He went up to the window to give his blessing at noon. The front page of the Wall Street Journal today says Pope emerges and, is out on the square, and early this morning hearing the news of his death. So the Pope is 88 years old. As Marianne said, he's had a lot of health issues. He had a part of his lung removed when he was a very young man, and so breathing and lung issues were his bailiwick for a long, long time. He really was very close to dying, apparently, when he was in the hospital a few weeks ago. And it was a blessing that he got out of the hospital and was able to get back to home and back to St. Peter's. So very, very sad for us because we lost a great leader. But as a Catholic, we mourn with hope because we know the joy that we trust that he gets to experience now.
Of course, Marianne, I think maybe the Pope's failing health in the last few weeks and months has allowed, I think, people all over the world, and Catholics especially, to reflect on who he is as a man, who he was as a Pope. How are his early remembrances now coming in the first hours since Francis's death?
Well, from the very beginning, when he first became Pope, we knew this was someone who is going to be different. That his background being from South America, so he was not the traditional European model, as we'd like to say, of a pope who was conforming to those standards. And within weeks of someone on an airplane coming back from a trip, he was asked about a gay couple, and his answer was, "Who am I to judge?" That set the tone. Don't you think of all? That first phrase of, who am I to judge? People went, wow, That's the Pope. And he is saying that about gay couples. Well, that's interesting. And they appreciated the kindness of that statement instead of, by golly, this is what we're going to do, and here's the rules, and da da da. There are those who do like those rules and did not have that same thought.
And we're going to talk about his legacy a lot. I want to ask, all the firsts, like you mentioned, the first Pope from Latin America and the first Jesuit, which you are also a member of that same order, Father. So I want to ask you, for people who may not know, first explain to us, what is a Jesuit?
So a Jesuit, it's a religious order in the Catholic Church. There are a lot of religious orders, a couple hundred religious orders in the Catholic Church. People might be familiar with Franciscans or Dominicans, Jesuits, and others. We were founded by St. Ignatius Loyola in the 16th century as part of a movement in the church. It was really growing up in light of the Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation had been in full swing, and Ignatius, as part of his own conversion at that period of time, decides to found a religious order. And a religious order to ultimately, it would be decided, was a lot about education, was a lot about schools. But Ignatius's basic sensibility of the world and what we were supposed to be about was a spirituality, a way of being in the world, to receive a training as a Jesuit in a way of looking at the world and recognizing God in everything. That is, not just in the confines of a church, but to find God in everything, to find God in our lived experience, to be reflective about our lived experience, and to, with God's help, appreciate that more deeply. As a result, the Jesuit way of looking at the world, one way of thinking about it, is harsh divisions between the sacred and the secular aren't necessarily operative here, right? The sensibility of this is all a part of God's creation, and that this all comes together. And so that, plus an intellectual tradition, I think makes Jesuits comfortable with questions, and makes Jesuits comfortable with questions that may not have easy or immediate answers. And so I think you see in Francis a lot, you saw this great willingness to ask the questions. Now, that's a funny role for a pope to take, and it's very atypical of how popes typically operate. As Marianne hints, the way that popes tend to speak, they used to speak in sort of the royal we, or as Holy Mother Church has always taught. And those are wonderful traditions of our faith. But Francis's sensibility was a willingness to ask some of those questions out loud in a way that previous popes, certainly in my lifetime, really didn't do. That's just not how you did it.
And you think that was impacted by him being a Jesuit?
Oh, I think very much so. Because I think your Jesuit training helps you to live into the questions, if you will, right? It's a willingness. There's no reason to be afraid of a question. It may not be easy to ask. There may not be an easy solution to it. So whether it's the life of LGBTQ Catholics, or whether it's questions about the plight of the poor, let's talk about it. And so you see that play itself out in his big focus on dialogue, his big focus. He loved the word encounter, that it's about encountering other people, and especially encountering other people that aren't exactly like you, and going to the margins, that sensibility. You know, they say, and of course, when they talk about what happens in a conclave, you have to guess, well, maybe, maybe not.
There's no press corps inside of
There's no press corps, and they always say those who know aren't talking, and those who are talking don't know. And so, but they say that that Bergoglio, one of the things that he had said at the previous conclave, when ultimately Pope Benedict was selected,
as 2005,
that he said, the question they ask in the conclave is not who's the best person to be pope. The question is, what does the church need now? And so it's framed as a response to the leadership need of the church. Bergoglio apparently spoke, and it's consistent with what he said as pope. We've become self-referential. The church has closed in on itself. And this is a quote: a self-referential church is a sick church. And so he wanted the cardinals to think about the church as a missionary organization going out into the world. That's very much his Jesuit life and training too. That sense of going into the world, not staying in the confines of the university or the church or whatever it might be, but to go into the world, because you can trust that God is out there too. And I think you saw that play out in Francis all over the place.
You have met Pope Francis, and I would like to hear that story of how you met him and what that interaction was like.
Well, it's not like we hung out together or anything, but I met him on two occasions, just briefly in one of those, audiences, one big audience and one smaller audience. And he was a very electric personality. He loved being around people. He loved being around people, and he could work a room and had an aura about him that was. It was more than just the enjoyment of being with people. There was something about Francis. And the person who commented on this first was Cardinal George, actually, which was, I remember when Bergoglio became Pope, and they were interviewing Cardinal George. It might have been you interviewing him. I don't know, Mary, but they were interviewing Cardinal George in Rome after the conclave. And the thing that he said about Bergoglio was, I think he's the freest man I've ever known. And what he went on to describe was what we would refer to as a spiritual or interior freedom, freed up to do what God's asked him to do. And I think people that have known Bergoglio knew Bergoglio long before he was Pope, said they saw that in him as Pope where they might not have seen it years before. And he clearly felt like, I'm going to do this job the way I believe that God and the Holy Spirit are asking me to do this. And you got that when you were near him. The second time that I had seen him, he was in his wheelchair, and so they kept us seated so that we could just shake his hand. And he moves down the line, and they're moving him along. And I was with a family actually of folks, and he shook my hand, and they're sort of moving along. And in very lame Italian, I said, "Oh, Holy Father, I liked your homily." He gave a homily where he talked about one of the Jesuit saints, and I said, "I'm a Jesuit," and he sort of pulled me in like this. And then he took my other hand, and then he blessed me on my forehead, and then patted me on the head. I read that as "get back to work," right? Just let's go. Don't sit
out into that world you care about.
Exactly. He doesn't say, "Don't sit here with me at this. Go do the work." I think is probably what he was probably saying.
We're going to dig a little bit more in a second into the specific policies and how he differed from predecessors. But I want to ask Marianne a little more broadly about legacy. How big of a deal was it that he was doing all of these things, asking these questions? Because certainly there is a big faction in the church that wants to reject this. Am I wrong? That wants to say, no, we should continue to do it exactly the way we have always done. One of the things we've heard about his legacy so far is that it is divisive. What do you make of that other part that said maybe we shouldn't be doing it the way that Pope Francis is introducing?
I think the church is facing the same challenges that we see going on in our own political worlds, not just in the United States, but across globally. And there is this fight within, we might all be Catholics or we might all be Americans, but we don't necessarily all agree on the same way of living our lives. And so that goes for the Catholic Church. And Francis, to me, was someone who said this is a big tent. Benedict, maybe not as much. Benedict was someone who said these are the rules and we're going to follow these rules. And so we've had this complete flip sort of the script with Francis. So that's why so many are wondering what's next. Will it be as because of the 138 that will elect the new pope? Many of them have been chosen by Francis. But does that mean that they're not also going to be persuaded by others who say it's time to maybe return to some of those standards and rules that we have set in place?
We won't know that momentum really until the conclave is finished, until they have a new selection. Does it become a pendulum where they swing back, or does it continue to move in that same direction? Speaking about his legacy, I want to hit on some of those finer points. Issues of women's role in the church, LGBTQ people, immigrants. Those were some of the focus, it seems like, at least in terms of what he was trying to change in the church, Marianne. Where did he stand on all that? What did he do in those columns? And maybe what didn't he do?
Even the mention of LGBTQ Catholics, just to say that word out there would be something that previous popes had not talked about. So by welcoming and saying we are a big house, that was such a change. Women definitely received more roles, but they're still not women deacons. They're not women priests. Migrants, immigration, such a key part of his legacy. And to his last weekend, meeting with J.D. Vance. From what I've read, and we'll have to decipher whether all of this is accurate, but he did not meet with J.D. Vance first. The vice president met with the Secretary of State, Parolin. And after that meeting, where they said there was a good discussion of the migrant issue, because Vance and the Pope had openly disagreed. Letters were being sent back and forth. The Pope was sending letters to the American bishops saying, wait a minute, don't forget about all the folks here who are marginalized. Don't let this happen. So to his final days, he was speaking in favor of the migrant crisis. And I think they agreed to disagree, but he also then did meet with Vice President Vance on his last day.
Yeah. What do you think about, Father, about him focusing on some of these issues that may have not been spoken about at length for a long time in the church? And then also, how do you see his legacy more broadly, his accomplishments, and maybe what he did not do?
So I think part of the challenge when you talk about issues, as we would identify, so women in the church, for example, or LGBTQ Catholics, we have we Americans have a way of framing these issues, right? And we use language. It's not just Americans, but we use a lot of political language. We use a lot of language about left and right, or about progressive and conservative, and those are useful labels at some level. But I think Francis kind of eludes the labeling in many ways. I don't think Francis became Pope and said, "Here's my agenda. It's these 5 things or these 10 things." But I do think that his love of listening to the experience of people in the church, and women would be a huge example of this, like the voice of women not being much of a part of the deliberations of the church for a very, very long time, and simply to include women more in a more robust way at the most recent 2 synod meetings was radical, that those women were in the room and that they were having those conversations and they were having input into the determination of the future of the church. At the same time, lots of people had expectations that one of the things that would come out of that synod was there'd be this real clear movement toward the approval of women as deacons, an ordained position in the church. And it didn't happen. And so there's this strange sort of mixture. Now, some of it, the political analysis would say Francis kept running into buzzsaws, like just the way that the hierarchy is set up, and the
People did
curia,
not want to change
it just wasn't. And the church, by its nature, really has to be resistant to change. I know that sounds silly in some way, especially Americans don't like to think that way, but they always say Rome thinks in centuries, right? The church is by nature conservative, not on a political spectrum, but in the idea of being slow to change.
Right.
So I think he greatly advanced some of those things, but clearly didn't do as much as a lot of folks probably would have liked him to have done on some of those issues. Part of that, I think, is his willingness to ask the questions, to have a synod and say, let's talk about it, and then to come out of it and still not have the exact outcome that some folks wanted. I think, I don't know the mind of Pope Francis, but observing him from the outside and knowing how Jesuits tend to think, I think he was fine with the unanswered question, or that we're making progress and we're going to move along this way. Listening to the stories, the dialogue and the encounter, I think that's what helps shape a different way of looking at things. That Francis knew people who would speak to them about being LGBTQ, right? That they would share their experience. That wasn't necessarily a thing I think that previous popes were able or interested in doing, perhaps. I think the legacy takes time to sort out, right? I think the legacy is profound in shifting the focus of the world church in a lot of ways, to speak without apology about migrants and immigrants and refugees as somehow at the center of the mission of the church, regardless of politics. I think, the first interview he gave, or one of the first, it was with the Jesuit magazine America, right after he was named Pope. They asked what his image of church or his model of church was. And the way he described it was the church is a field hospital. And it captures a lot of the elements of what I think will be his legacy. An idea that the church isn't locked up within itself. It's on the move. It's a mobile hospital, right? And it's a hospital. It's supposed to be a source of healing. It's supposed to be a source of reconciliation. And so that means reconciliation among Catholics themselves, reconciliation with humanity and creation. His great encyclical Laudato Si, clearly a big part of his legacy will be, this is a pope that spoke passionately about the environment. And in typical Francis fashion, it wasn't simply a, hey, let's recognize we're destroying the earth. It was, and it impacts the poor at a disproportionate experience to anybody else in the world. That this is killing people and speaking for the voiceless, he would say. So I think those things, if you look at what he wrote, if you look at what he said, the willingness to dialogue, whether it's in a synod or in a conversation on an airplane with reporters or whatever it might be, to have conversation, to encounter other people, to go to the margins, as Marianne said. He loved that image, the margins. Where are the people that have gotten pushed aside? Where are the people that have been pushed out of the center of the circle? And what does it look like to be brothers and sisters to each other? That would be a legacy any pope would be proud to have, because it's the gospel.
Pope Francis never came to Chicago. He did come to the United States. What was Marianne, I'll start with you. What do you think Chicago Catholics, broadly speaking, that some 2 million of us here around Chicago, what do you think they thought of Pope Francis, both at the beginning of his papacy and now through to the end?
Well, when they didn't know who he was, everyone was quizzical at the beginning, wanting to know more about who he was. That day on the Vatican Square when he was announced, and I happened to be there to see the smoke, And someone texted me and said, he is a Jesuit, which
It's a big deal.
it set off sort of, okay, all right, well, he's going to, not only is he from South America, he's a Jesuit. We got someone who's way different than what we're used to, I thought to myself. But I find it interesting today. I have had at least 10 texts from people who know that I cover the church and say, in their own words, I hope the next pope is as kind.
Ooh, okay.
So that kindness, that willingness to hear from all sides, that outreach, that was noted. That was very much noted.
There's never unanimity on policies or beliefs or how the church should go forward in certain issues, but it seems in terms of the personality, this is what you're getting to, it seems. Like the way he treated people and spoke to them was what people were really drawn to. And you just spoke about it even being in his presence those couple of times.
Yeah, I think it's undeniable that he liked people, that he cared deeply about people and to be a voice for the poor and those who don't have a voice. I think that's something everybody agrees is admirable. I think the Catholic Church in Chicago is like the Catholic Church in the world in many ways, right? I mean, you've got people all over the spectrum of experience and attitudes about particular issues and the ways that we worship. I mean, it's extraordinary how unified we are after 2,000 years. It's miraculous that we are as unified as we are because we're all so different. And so, but I do think he unified, people would be unified in a sense of appreciation and respect for his passion for the gospel, his kindness, which was manifested in a lot of ways. And he could be tough for sure. And yet his openness to the questions and his openness to possibilities, you would call when he first came out on the balcony, which is such a formal thing, of course, right? I mean, what else is more formal in the world? And all those things we later heard, like there's a great story of the papal dresser, the guy who came in to give him all the official stuff that he should wear. He said, I'm not wearing that. And I'm not wearing that. And he just wanted to wear the simple white cassock. And he used to wear these black, like Velcro shoes, and it's just very, very simple. And then he comes out on the balcony and of course, everyone's waiting for his blessing, which he does, but he asks first for the people's blessing. Yeah. He said, will you bless me? Yes. And so that sense of the Vatican II model of church is the people of God, and he clearly appreciated that and wanted to live that. And I think Catholics, regardless of how they might feel about a lot of different issues, I think Catholics can be united in that appreciation of that he loved his people, and he always asked people to pray for him. He'd leave a meeting and say, pray for me. I pray for you, you pray for me.
Didn't want to live in the palace, didn't want to live in the palatial apartments. Yeah.
And that departure maybe from previous popes goes even through his death. I want to help people understand here kind of what comes next from this point now, people who are listening and watching. So let's talk about the funeral. He is changing some things from previous funerals of popes. Father, can you tell us what he wants to do differently? Maybe, I know you don't maybe have everything in front of you, but what he wants to change that may make it a little more like everybody else.
Yeah, I think he simplified it. He wrote a document not too long ago, which is not unusual that a pope would express to his staff and to those who would be managing the papal household, as they say. It's not unusual that a pope would put down some preferences for how he wanted things. It's clear that it was a simplification of some things. It's a simplification of how he is to be buried. He didn't want, for example, it sounds gruesome perhaps, but in St. Peter's Square, when the body's on display, usually they will prop up the Pope, so he's sort of leaning, he's kind of at an angle facing the people. He doesn't want that. He wanted to simplify the actual casket that he was in so that it was just a simpler casket. He's going to be buried at St. Mary Major Basilica, not at St. Peter's. He didn't want to be buried at the Vatican. Because he has a great love of that church. He has a great devotion to Mary, and he loves the church Mary Major, St. Mary Major, one of the major basilicas there. So I think there's a lot, and Marianne, you may know more about, but just a lot of simplification. And we don't know yet exactly when the funeral will be. My guess would be his desire was, let's do this as fast as possible. Remember when he became Pope, he kept telling people in Argentina, do not spend money on a plane ticket to come and see me become Pope. That's a waste of money. Okay. Give your money to the poor, go do some service.
He might say the same about a funeral.
I think he would say the same thing about the funeral.
Yeah. Well, we do know, according to the Vatican, they've given us some kind of media guidelines. So we know the funeral will be between day 4 and 6 after his death. And so perhaps at the end of the week, Friday, Saturday, something like that. And then the conclave would be 15 days after his death. So that sounds like around May 5th. And that would, so there is a prescribed mourning time. And we actually do, you don't want to say celebrate, that's probably not the right word, but remember all.
Commemorate.
Yes,
Yep.
remember all that he had done.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this will be your third conclave. You are
Yeah.
going over to Rome to cover the succession of who should succeed Pope Francis. What is a conclave for people who do not know? They may have seen the movie. We'll get to that in a second. Take us through the kind of the steps of what a conclave is and what it does.
Now, even before they meet, they have what are called general congregations, and they discuss the health of the church. In fact, there is one called for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in Rome. Now, not everyone obviously will be there. It takes some time for people to gather, for the cardinals to come.
138 of them, is that what you say?
And there's actually like 250 some
Okay.
cardinals.
You just can't vote when you're over 80.
Yes, so 138 are 80 and under.
Okay.
And so then they will, when the conclave actually starts, all of that is true of no phones, no iPads, and none of that, no way to communicate. In fact, they claim that they have electronic jamming devices to make sure that there is not eavesdropping. You know, as if you could sit outside the Sistine, but they meet inside the Sistine Chapel, and they gather according to how long they've been there by seniority. That's how they're seated. I believe the first day, and this is from just reading again today about this, there is only one vote. You need a 2/3 majority. Very unlikely to get that on the first vote. And what happens is they literally take the ballots and they burn them. And the smoke that appears when you do not have a 2/3 majority is gray. They add a chemical to it to make that gray, and they also add a chemical to make it white when they finally do have that majority. But after the first day, they take up to 4 ballots a day. So most likely it would be like 2 or 3 days of voting.
And you gave us a little bit of a window just based on what you heard in the past in terms of how cardinals talk about each other and how they should be represented. I mean, of course, factions get made and then it goes forward. What a fascinating process that we only get to see once every few decades or so.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's not immune from the normal sort of politics of human beings being together. And some of these cardinals would know each other very well. Some would not know each other at all, probably, given age and geography. And so the idea that there's certainly collegiality by their office, but they're not necessarily collegial by a lot of lived experience. You know, it's like most of the things we undertake as human beings. There's both this lovely, human, clumsy way, and then there's this hope that God's helping do this and lead this thing. You think about the drama of it. If you've ever been in the Sistine Chapel, or at least seen images of the Sistine Chapel, it's beautiful. They're seated underneath Michelangelo's painting of the Last Judgment. You know, the notion is pay attention, like this final judgment of your life, and you've been entrusted with the church. Are you judging this in the way that Michelangelo depicts it here? And so movies love it and novels love it because it's got so much secrecy around it and so much power. But I also need to trust, and we as Catholics need to trust that the Holy Spirit is somehow involved in this. And these cardinals are people of prayer. They'll listen to each other. They've thought about this question before tomorrow or whenever the conclave starts in a couple of weeks. It's extraordinary. It really is. And there's something beautiful about the simplicity of it too. I mean, the jamming technology or whatever it might be, where there is this sense of let us focus on this moment. Let us focus on each other and the question here. And we're not going to check, X and Twitter or to see what's happening out there.
What are some of the names that you've read so far, Marianne, or have been hearing about as people start to look for who may lead the church next? We've read that Pope Francis has modeled the cardinals to the greatest extent that he could in his image when it came to belief, perhaps. What do you think? How do you think the church will go forward?
And as Father McGrath already said, the famous line of the person who goes in thinking he's going to be cardinal walks out not as the as the Pope.
Right.
Yes. Well, Francis has chosen more candidates from developing countries than anyone. So it's not as European-centered as before. So you hear names like the Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines, who now I believe is at the Vatican, has a Vatican position. His name came up before when Bergoglio was chosen. Turkson from Africa, Cardinal Turkson, also, again, no longer in Africa, is already at the Vatican. The Secretary of State, Parolin, is someone considered. Supposedly, the Italian that he is considered a France's favorite is Ziri. So there are names.
Yeah.
There are also names. Erdo from Hungary is considered the leading conservative. From the Netherlands, Egik, is a former physician, former doctor. So there is a very diverse, as far as, they're all men, hello. But yes, there is a
Geographically,
diverse, right,
yeah.
very
Believe.
diverse geographically.
Yeah. Father, what would you like to see come out of this conclave? I mean, do you have thoughts on the kind of person you would like to see selected, or at least what would you be satisfied with when they do come out and pick a successor?
I think it's safe to say there's not going to be another Jesuit this time.
Okay.
And maybe ever again. I don't
for you while it lasted.
Yeah.
It was a good run. You know, I want the next pope to be, this sounds idyllic, but to be a man of prayer, but a man of action and a man that's willing to listen to people. And I think we had that in Francis. And I think for Francis's fundamental observation about the church becoming self-referential, I think that is spot on and dangerous, right? That sensibility that if we're just talking to ourselves and we've forgotten what it is to engage with the world, to engage the difficult question, to listen to people's real lives, especially the ones that are difficult to hear, perhaps, where people say, I've felt like a second-class citizen in the Catholic community, or I was deeply wounded or hurt by the church because I'm divorced and remarried, or because whatever the situation of their life might be. I think Francis opened doors to conversation and healing, and I'd hope that would continue. I also want the Pope to be what the Pope's supposed to be, which is also the guarantor of the faith, right? So there's a necessary sort of conservative attitude to dramatic change, but there's a way to move forward here too. And so those are all some great names. I don't know much about, these cardinals. That the cardinal who's in the Holy Land gets mentioned once when he's in Italia. He's got a phenomenal name. His name is Pizzaballa. I mean, Americans have a field day with that. But he's another name that comes up, and we Americans bet on everything now. Good luck trying to bet on this, because there's just too many unknowns.
And it could be, and it could be none of those. We may find
It could
out.
be very much could be none of those.
There are a few Chicago connections to the conclave, and going forward, Marianne, help us with what kind of Chicago touch.
Right. First of all, Cardinal Supich will
Right.
be there and will be a voting member, and has had an incredible relationship with the Pope, has been someone that the Pope has relied on for the American church. And in turn, Cardinal Supich has been able to help pick bishops, a new bishop in Cincinnati, now I'm going to forget all the other, Milwaukee, and he just had five new auxiliary bishops for Chicago, which is really unheard of, to get 5 new assistants through and be approved by the Vatican. So he's had a huge influence with Francis and those who are there in control right now. Will they be ones that listen? No one expects an American Pope. It could happen. No one expects it, but we do think that Supich will have influence. There is Cardinal Prevost. I don't know him, but he was the Augustinian leader of the Midwest, and he now has a Vatican position, has been close with the Pope. He is a voting member, and so some are mentioning his name. And then Wilton Gregory, who grew up in Chicago and he is just retired as the Cardinal of Washington, D.C. Before that had been in Atlanta, and before that was head of the church, the Catholic Conference in the United States, during the sex abuse, which was very difficult, but handled it, and I think most would say, in a very courageous and open way that he could have. So he's gone through a lot. And as a Black Catholic in the United States with this position, he will be listened to. So we have 3 right there, 3 Chicagoans. I think the Cardinal of Newark, Tobin, who had been in Indianapolis, is someone that people also look to. They want to know what they're thinking, where would they go? So while we might not see an American, very, very doubtful, I think the Americans do have influence on who is the next pope.
Father, I'm going to ask for your takeaway in just 1 second, but Marianne, I want to ask about the conclave moment that everyone waits for. What is it like to be in the square and see the smoke and know they've got one?
Oh, well, let me tell you, I was at the ice cream parlor. Yes, I'm at the gelato counter.
As you should. Yes, you're spending your time.
Yes, at the gelato counter with my photographer, Mabel Miller. And we hear people, saying there's going to be smoke. We hear there's sort of a rumbling ahead of time kind of thing. And we toss the gelato and just are running down to the square to find out what happened. I don't think we had one that day. But yes, there is a lot of excitement. There is. And then at first the smoke, I have to confess, I was like, is it gray? Is it out?
Right.
And it also depends on the time of day,
Right.
and the white didn't look as, I expected like puffs of beautiful white, cloudy smoke. It wasn't quite that, it's not Disney. It's kind of a little bit of puff. Yeah.
Right. That moment. Well, you're going to get that moment in just a few weeks. Wrapping up our conversation here, it's been so great to get your take, both of you, about where we are and where the church is going. Father, I want to ask you first, after everything, you've heard about today, and we're going to hear more in the coming weeks and months, of course, what is your takeaway from Pope Francis's papacy and how the church received him and how he received the papacy?
I think as a Jesuit, I so admired the way he lived his vocation. And his vocation in the last 12 plus years of his life was, I'm quite sure, not something he necessarily wanted to do and certainly never dreamed about doing, that is to become Pope. But it was what was asked of him. And I think this Holy Spirit was operative in that selection by the cardinals. And I think the way he inspired people to reimagine at times their relationship to God, their relationship to the church, ideas about people they maybe hadn't thought about a lot. I think he's left an indelible mark on the church in the world. He's created a new model for the papacy insofar as just the way of being. John Paul II did that with being young and vibrant and traveling all over the world. And I think Francis did that much, much older when he started in the role. But I think he shaped a new way of being Pope. Accessibility, dialogue, conversation, synodality, wanting his priests to be pastors, to really be pastors. He'd say to us all the time, you're not CEOs of NGOs. You're supposed to be pastors, and shepherds smell like their sheep. Know your people, I think there's just a whole lot there to take. I've been deeply consoled by it. Every moment hasn't been spectacular. It's true of any of us, but deeply consoled by his vocation in action as Pope. And that's inspiring to me. It really is inspiring to me as a Jesuit, as a Catholic, as a Chicagoan. Those things matter to me.
Marianne, what's your takeaway from Pope Francis's papacy and everything we've dealt with in the last day or so with now looking ahead?
A very big turning of the page, a very open door that had been nearly shut to these are the rules, and if you're not following them, you're no longer a Catholic. And I think that part, whether or not everyone agrees, I do think that most people today are feeling this loss of, he made me, and as you mentioned, whether I'm gay or whether I'm divorced or whether I didn't go to church for many years and want to come back, or I was never a Catholic and now I want to be a Catholic. He made me feel that I was welcome. And I love the image of him sitting on a bus, on a public bus. I think that obviously was in
First time in
Argentina.
Buenos Aires. Yeah, I saw that picture. I think it was
And
New York
that
Times.
just kind of, to me, says, okay, here's a guy who's lived some life, who, I loved the stories of he supposedly was a bouncer at a club, or he taught chemistry. he wasn't hidden in a closet. He wasn't hidden in a church building.
Right.
That's why
He wasn't
called it-
solely an administrator.
Yes.
Yeah.
He lived some life and understood that for the church to be vibrant, we've got to go live some life too and go out and reach them. And that, I hope, we'll see if the next pope does the same. But that will be, I believe, his lasting image.
Marianne, Father McGrath, thank you so much for coming in and helping us understand where the church is and where it's going. We appreciate the time.
Loved it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I love the discussion that we just had with Marianne and with Father McGrath. They have two great perspectives on this really special moment in history for the church and for the world. Full disclosure, I'm not Catholic, but I feel like I got a really great education just in these last few minutes or so, learning about where the church is and where it's going. So here's my takeaway on this. Pope Francis was obviously a very, very influential figure and took the church in a very different direction from where it had been going. Now, Catholics may love that. Catholics may not like that. But it's very clear to me that the church seems to be at an inflection point, with cardinals ultimately having to decide, are they going to keep going in that direction that Pope Francis was carving out and trying to carve out in the future of the church? Or maybe will it ultimately be like a pendulum? And the cardinals will ultimately decide that they'll need to move maybe in a different direction from where Pope Francis was taking them. But Pope Francis certainly generated some controversy, maybe in a good way, the way he wanted to do things a little bit differently. And we'll see if the cardinals end up electing a pope that will have the same dynamism, both on a personal level and, of course, on the level of the church, as Pope Francis had. I also know that the conclave is going to be absolutely fascinating here in the next couple of weeks. It's only something we get to see every few decades or so. And I'm so looking forward to Marianne's reports from Rome about that whole process and who the church will ultimately decide to lead it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed that conversation, here are some other episodes of The Takeaway. And don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to listen on the go, check us out on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.